More people taking shots at Oregon. I mean, okay.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks, which is why, if you have not already, please like, comment, subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to or watch this show, which is brought to you by our friends at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Is Oregon's schedule harder than 2023? That's coming up later on today's show, and some special teams chatter, because as we know, it matters a great deal. But first, here we go again. On3's Brent Hubbs. On3, rather large organization in the college sports world. Here's what he had to say as Oregon received some decommitments recently on the recruiting trail. I'm not sure if he gave this quote before or after the number one safety in the class of 2025 verbally committed to the Ducks, and they had a big video package put together to do so. Plus, he had a cool looking chain. I like the chain. I'm not usually a chain guy. That one's pretty cool. Here's what he had to say. Quote, here's the other thing, too. We talk about NIL a lot, right? NIL, NIL, NIL. At some point, when the money's pretty even, it comes down to where you're most comfortable. So you got to go recruit them. I think Oregon is learning this, right? Oregon just kind of had the thought process of, we'll just go buy us a class. And they've lost 3 or 4 commits in the last 2 weeks because they don't really want to work and live in Eugene. Oh, my gosh. The quote continues, and I don't think the coaches have relationships with those players that other schools have. Oh, man. Tell me you know nothing about Oregon without telling me you know nothing about Oregon. He goes on. I'm going to finish this quote because why the heck not? Quote, I think they've just said, well, we'll NIL it. You can't just NIL it because everybody's got NIL funds now, okay? I mean, at the Power 5 level, everybody's got a plan for NIL. So at some point, it comes back to old school recruiting in your relationships, and you've got to work at it. So I'm curious, Brent. I'm very, very curious. If you see or watch this show, shoot me a note. Does Oregon have unlimited NIL or not? Because people outside of Oregon that don't cover the Ducks and talk about them from afar can't seem to make up their minds. Coaches drop hints like Deshaun Foster, Kirby Smart. They got so much NIL. I want a piece of that. And I loved what Lanning said on the Pat McAfee show recently. I think it was last week or so when he said, yeah, it's amazing. Kirby Smart brought in the number one recruiting class with no NIL. It's incredible. Of course, being facetious because it's ridiculous. Yes, Oregon is a tier 1 NIL school. I would love to hear his thoughts on the Trey McNutt commitment. I'm sure he just thinks that McNutt is going to flip and Decorian Moore will flip because, you know, it's once they've got NIL. Because remember this. Think about Decorian Moore specifically. Once the NIL is equal, he says, you've got to establish relationships. I don't think they're establishing relationships. Well, I think they are, personally. But do you think the University of Texas, which financially is one of the most lucrative athletic departments in the entire country, do you think that they're lacking in NIL funds? Do you think that lineup of Lamborghinis they had walking into their facility for recruits to see as they go by, do you think that having Arch Manning still on the roster is because their NIL is just okay and he just loves Texas that much? I'm sure he likes Texas. I think Texas is a great place for Arch Manning to be. Do you think he's had other phone calls? Do you think he had other schools interested in him? Why do you think one of the reasons he's staying at Texas? Yeah, they're paying him a good amount of money. And by the way, I've got no problem with that. Texas is a tier 1 NIL school. I'd imagine Georgia is in that category. I'd imagine Bama is in that sort of category. I know that Texas is there for a fact. Oregon is there. SMU is there. A lot of these schools in Texas, by the way. If you go up and down the SEC, give me the programs that don't have elite NIL opportunities. So I get annoyed at the contradiction here when talking about Oregon. And yesterday on the show, when I discussed the national media pundits who were giving Oregon a lot of respect, this conflicting narrative about Oregon's recruiting feels more old school, feels more, we don't believe in Oregon yet. You haven't earned it. You don't have our trust or whatever, right? Or people disrespecting the Ducks. And you can say that's great and, putting a chip on Dan Lanning's shoulder and everybody else's and, that they don't listen to the outside noise. They hear it. They might not read or listen to all of it, but it's heard. It's noticed, whether you believe it is or not. Like in the locker room, players, coaches, they hear at least some of it. But this feels like a more old school look at Oregon in that you've got one narrative of, well, they're just getting all the NIL dollars. They're just doing all this. And then the other narrative is, no, the NIL is, when it gets equal, they can't build the relationships. Well, which one is it? Like, to me, this almost magnifies if Brent gave these comments. I don't know the exact date of it. The post I saw going around was just the other day. I don't know if that was before or after Trey McNutt committed, but I know it was well after DeCorian Moore committed. Like, if you got to build relationships at some point, Oregon just pulled in a top 5 recruiting class in 2024. They're going to push for a second straight top 5 recruiting class in 2025. What are we doing? What are we talking about? This goes back to my original point when, coaches or players or whoever, pundits, started making remarks about Oregon's NIL. It's low-hanging fruit. It is an easy target because everybody knows Nike and everybody knows Phil Knight. Ohio State has put over $20 million in NIL into this roster. Those are the reports, the estimates are out there. I had somebody tell me that number is indeed correct. It is not, I don't think it hits 30, but it is over $20 million. Where are these comments about Ohio State? Maybe they're out there and I just haven't seen them. But is the narrative surrounding Ohio State's number 1 ranked recruiting class in 2025, is it that they're just buying players? No. It's that they're Ohio State. They're a big brand. They're a great staff, which they are. And they have NIL dollars. You think LSU is short on dollars to give to kids with an NIL collective? You think they're short on support for their football program or having a couple of wealthy boosters down there? You think Texas A&M is short on these sorts of guys? Like this stuff, I'm sure you can tell, it tires me out. It bugs me that people just choose to talk about Oregon in this sense. And I think it's incredibly lazy and not... It doesn't have, the comment reflects a lack of understanding about what Oregon has done on the recruiting trail because they were already elevating their recruiting profile before NIL. And just because they're doing it in the NIL era doesn't mean it is solely because of NIL. They have kept pace with the top tier programs of where they want to get to. You can say there's a what's the word that I'm looking for here? Gosh, English is so hard. There's a boost to the recruiting, that there's a slight bump. But to say that Oregon is just going out and buying players and that they don't establish relationships, I think shortchanges Dan Lanning, shortchanges the staff, and all the work they put in to getting these sorts of recruits and having these big classes. So there's my rant to begin today's show. Gosh, we're on a heater right now. Oh, man, I could keep going, but I think I've made my point. Brent Hubbs of On3. Come on, man. That was a great segment. I don't know if they still do that. I don't know if they still do that on NFL Live, but I know they used to. Is Oregon's schedule harder in 2023 or harder in 2024 than it was in 2023? I'm going to examine that question coming up next. This episode's brought to you by our friends over at Game Time, an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on that Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. They've got killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying Major League Baseball tickets. You can save up to 60% buying last minute for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, whatever you're looking for. You can save even more with exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game or event. Take the guesswork out of buying Major League Baseball tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE. That's Locked On College, all one word, for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Sometimes you need a second segment sip, or I need a second segment sip to cool myself off a little bit. I should have taken a few minutes. I'm all wound up. I just see that stuff and my eyes roll up into my skull. But not the case with the schedule, because I love Oregon's schedule. The Ducks have a very favorable schedule for their first season in the Big Ten, which is a nice kind of present from the league of sorts. I don't know that they did it on purpose, but it won't be this favorable or workable every year going forward. But I think that for the Ducks schedule, you can look at it and say they have they have a tougher string of high-end opponents than they had in the Pac-12. You can say it. But when you look at Oregon's schedule a season ago, I thought going into the year they would go 10-2. And as the games went on and I was picking the games, I picked them to go 11-1, and they did. And going into the year, I thought they would lose at Washington, and I thought they would lose at Utah. But then when Cam Rising wasn't healthy, I thought, Oregon's going to win. I picked Oregon to cover that 6.5-point spread, and they won the game 35-6. So I think that Oregon had games last year that challenged them, that they just played very well. Utah, for instance, was a good team. They weren't a great team, but they were a good team. Washington was a great team. And Texas Tech was a good team. Cal was a good team. And Oregon was able to win those football games. Now, Texas Tech wasn't quite as easy as Cal. They'd kind of gotten things going. But I was thinking about this and whether it makes Oregon's schedule harder this year than last year because of a question that came from Nathan. YouTube comments, X, formerly known as Twitter. If you want priority access and a bunch of other perks, go join the flock over at Subtext. Link is below. And you get a free 14-day trial. Nathan asks, I'm interested in hearing what you think about my take. Basically, I think we're getting a lot of love in the media this year, and I'm worried we have our expectations set too high. I'd rather have high expectations than low ones. We didn't really beat anybody great last year, although the Utah game was great. I think we could easily lose 3 games this year, Michigan, Ohio State, and one other, and that would disappoint people. I'm hoping for undefeated, but I feel like we need to take a deep breath and hope for the best before the season starts. Well, you always take a deep breath and hope for the best, of course. But you got to be able in your mind to give Oregon credit. I understand the worry that some fans have getting your expectations up. Michigan lost their offensive coordinator, they lost their defensive coordinator, their head coach, and 18 players, including their first-round quarterback, to the NFL draft. They are not going to be as good as they were last season. Are they still a good team? Yeah, I think so. I think they're an 8-9 team, 8-9 win team in the Big Ten. Could Oregon go into Ann Arbor and lose? 100%. I also could have foreseen, even with Bryson Barnes, Oregon going in to Utah and losing. But what did they do? They played a great game. And Michigan has a high floor because of their style, because we know Sharon Moore can coach on game days, and they have a good program. Their ceiling is not as high as Oregon's. And that, to me, is very similar to Utah from a season ago. Is this year's Michigan team better than last year's Utah team with Bryson Barnes? Probably. Is there a monumental gap between the two? No, I don't think so. Because I think Michigan is an 8-9 win team, and Utah was an 8-win team last year, even though they had a pig farmer at quarterback, Bryson Barnes, who's at Utah State right now. If you're curious, he's going to be their starting quarterback in all likelihood. But I think that for the Ducks, if they go into Ann Arbor and they play the way they're capable of, I don't think Michigan can match that level because you will have a big gap at quarterback. And if Oregon's playing the way they're capable, then they're matching up in the trenches or even beating Michigan in the trenches. The Wolverines are turning over 4 starting spots on their offensive line. They have one guy who is or was going to be a starter going into last year, and then he got hurt. They've had a good culture with the offensive line. It's a little bit Mario Cristobal-esque in that you kind of have faith that it's going to be good no matter what. But is it going to be as good as last year? No, I don't think so. They've got a great running back in Donovan Edwards. They've got a couple solid pass catchers. We don't yet know who's going to throw them the football. But if Oregon plays their best, Michigan cannot match that level. Just like Utah a year ago. Oregon played a great game. And it wasn't just that they won. It was that they won 35-6. Can they beat Michigan 35-6? No, probably not. Michigan can muster up more than that. But could they win the game? by 15 to 20 points if they play well? Yes, absolutely. Oregon is at that level. Now they have to play at that level, right? We saw in the Pac-12 championship game, Oregon didn't play well. Game plan wasn't perfect, weren't executing, got off to a slow start, eventually rallied and made it a game, but no, they didn't play their best that day. So that's what it can come down to in college football. That sounds very simple, but that's the way that it is. Ohio State, yeah, that's obviously a game Oregon can lose. It's a coin flip game. I think Oregon's going to win it because they are at home. But to say that there could be 3 losses this year, 3 losses to me would be, number one, it would make Oregon miss the playoff. 9-3 in the Big Ten, you're not getting into the playoff because I don't think Oregon would have enough quality wins. And number 2, yeah, it would be a massive letdown. Missing the playoff this year, having 3 regular season losses, it'd be a massive letdown. I don't think that's going to happen because Dan Lanning has improved as a head coach. We saw that from year 1 to year 2. The roster was better, the performances were better, and he was better as a head coach. I have no reason to think, therefore, he can't get even better going into year 3. And you look at the number of returners, you look at the talent they've brought in, all the pieces are there for Oregon to succeed. But yeah, could they go 10-2? Yeah, I think that's incredibly reasonable. I don't think that would be some massive letdown of a season as long as they were going to wind up in the college football playoff. But is this schedule that much harder than the one Oregon played a year ago? I don't think so. I really don't think so. Is Ohio State a national championship caliber team? Yes. Is Michigan? No. Is Michigan good? Yes. So I think this year's Michigan is comparable to last year's Utah. Okay. But last year, the national championship caliber team Oregon played, that was Washington, had them on the road. Still should have won the football game. You've got Ohio State at home this year. And then you look at the non-conference slate, I can make the case pretty easily. I think it's almost plainly obvious that this year's non-conference is significantly easier than last year because your road game is Oregon State, who this year are not going to be as tough of a team as Texas Tech was last year. Texas Tech ended the year 7-6, and you had to go play them in week 2. Hadn't quite, gotten everything firing on all cylinders just yet. That was a game Oregon easily could have lost. I do not see Oregon. They shouldn't have a close game in their non-conference slate. Idaho, they're going to blow them out. Boise State might push them early, but I think Oregon should be able to pull away. They can be pesky, as Oregon fans know very well. And then Oregon State, they're going to be a 20-point road favorite. So that game should be won by double digits. At least, at least 10 to 14 points, if not more. They're capable of covering that number in Corvallis. Like Oregon State, they're going to be a solid Mountain West team, but what should Oregon do to a solid Mountain West team? Beat them by 3 to 4 touchdowns. They should. So I understand where your concern is coming from. I'd be pretty surprised, barring an injury to Dylan Gabriel or mass injuries across the roster like Utah had a season ago, I'd be pretty surprised if Oregon loses 3 games on this year's schedule. I think 10 is the minimum number of games I expect Oregon to win, and I'm not going to give away what my season prediction is going to be for Oregon's record this year. Their win total's 10.5. Right now, if you asked me to pick, I'd have them going over 10.5. I would. I think they're that good. I think everything is there for Oregon. You can kind of ease into the season. You don't have a big heavy hitter. Ohio State on October 12th, you win that football game. The confidence is going to be brimming all across that locker room. So I don't think this schedule is, even though you're in the Big Ten, it's a bigger conference, it's tougher, it's this, that, and the other thing. I don't think it's noticeably harder than last year. I don't even know that it is. Ohio State at home. Last year's Washington game on the road. Last year they had the Utah game on the road. And then you look at the rest of the opponents, and yeah, Wisconsin can be tricky, but Washington's not going to be what they were last year, nor is Oregon State. And Oregon State, by the way, is a team Oregon beat 31-7 at Autzen Stadium. They have to go to Corvallis, but as I said, don't anticipate that being a problem. And then you have a bunch of, rebuilding UCLA, rebuilding Michigan State, Maryland, Purdue. Purdue could maybe be tricky, but I don't think this schedule is any different than last year, and Oregon was a field goal away from perhaps being undefeated. A field goal or a decision or whatever you want to talk about with that game up in Seattle. They were that close to being undefeated in the regular season. That's why it is absolutely in play. Good question, though. Very, very good question. Got a couple more questions to answer and some special teams talk, which is not something that can be ignored. And we'll talk about that next. All right, before we talk special teams, another mailbag question, which I'm such a fan of. Again, YouTube comments, Twitter, or subtext, which gets priority access and a bunch of other perks. Link is below. Free 14-day trial. This one from Nick. Long two-part question that you should feel free to paraphrase. Going through YouTube random podcasts was surprised to see one arguing Oregon's the most overrated program in the Big Ten. This is a quick answer for me. You can't know whether Oregon's overrated or underrated as a program in the Big Ten because they haven't played in the Big Ten yet. You could say they're the most overrated team. I don't agree with that particular notion. And also, as Josh Pate always asks, what are they rated? What do you think they're going to be? They're the preseason number 2 favorite to win the Big Ten in the odds market. If you don't think they're worthy of that, if you think it should be Penn State instead, okay. I'll take Oregon. I like Dylan Gabriel more than I like Drew Aller, and I think Oregon's track record in big games is a lot better than Penn State's because the last time Oregon played Ohio State, they won. Penn State hasn't beaten Ohio State since 2016, 18. It's been a minute for Penn State. They struggle against everyone named Ohio State and Michigan, and everybody other than that, they're great. Oregon's track record, they beat heavy hitters in the conference, and they beat heavy hitters in college football. No, they don't win every single big game that they play. Obviously, random YouTube commenter who I'm anticipatedly replying to here. I don't know what word I was going to say, but anyway. Nick says, part 2 to my question. I've always believed an opinion or idea should be able to be defended when pressed or challenged. As Oregon fans, I think it's safe to say we haven't had to stand up to an argument that way to this point. Everyone seems to be implying that Oregon's season doesn't start until the Big Ten championship game, that the rest is just automatic. Love your show. Let's say that person comes on your show and says that. How will you defend us Oregon fans' belief of them being great? Well, I'm not in the camp of Oregon's overrated and they're just going to coast until the Big Ten championship game. I do expect Oregon to make the Big Ten championship game, just to be clear. I just don't think it's going to be easy, but when you have a mix of a veteran at quarterback, a third-year head coach, and veteran talented leadership all over this team on both sides of the ball, it makes it easier in my mind to pick Oregon to get there. I've said several times and talked this week about the schedule and why it is so favorable for Oregon to get to the Big Ten championship game and to get to the playoff. And Heather Dinich thinks, or at least according to ESPN's FPI, they have a 76% chance to make the college football playoff this year. That's great. I think they are worthy of that sort of national recognition. Are they going to coast? No. Like Ohio State and Michigan, you're not coasting through those games. At Wisconsin, at Purdue, you're not coasting through those games. Now, you could end up beating Purdue by a lot. I'm really curious to watch the Boilermakers early in the season and get a feel for what their team is going to be like and how much of a challenge they can actually present. Because they've got a quarterback who's fine. Like Hudson Card, he's fine. He's solid, capable. But does he have enough around him? That's the question. I have not done a deep dive on Purdue's offseason going into the year. If you'd like me to and you want to hear about it, I can. But, I think they're going to be okay. Like, it's hard to know. It's hard to know. I think Ryan Walters was given a pretty tough deck of cards going into last year after, 2 years ago, Purdue was in the Big Ten championship game. Now, that was only because they were, winners of the Big Ten East, I think was the division that didn't have Ohio State, Penn State, and Michigan on the same side of the bracket there. But still, Purdue is capable of being a good program. It's just a matter of whether they are a good team in 2024. If they are, that game could be difficult. Washington is going to give you a fight. I think we've seen that last couple of years. I know that Oregon is a big favorite, and they're a big favorite against Oregon State. Your rivals are not going to roll over and just give you a game. You got to show up. You got to play your best. I do expect Oregon to be all right in those games. So I don't think Oregon coasts to the Big Ten championship game the way Ohio State and Michigan have the last couple of years because they have several, big games. And Ohio State and Michigan have even struggled at times Ohio State barely beat Notre Dame last year. They should have lost. And Ohio State and Michigan have always had to go through each other. I don't think it's a coast to the Big Ten championship game. I do think Oregon's capable of getting there. One of you asked about special teams. I wanted to close with a little bit of special teams talk today because we have seen in Dan Lanning's losses at Oregon, aside from the Georgia game, special teams have played a rather important role. And we've seen that with losses at Autzen Stadium going back to the early 2010s and such, with names I need not bring up. But I'm pretty bullish on Oregon special teams this year for a couple of reasons. Number one, Ross James was exceptional last year. His inside the 20 percentage was great. His average punt distance was phenomenal. He also has pressure to keep performing at a high level because they've got Luke Dunn, as I think the other punter's name, who's backed him up a season ago. I'm going to double check that real quick because I don't want to get his name wrong here. Yeah, Luke Dunn is his name, and he's seen a little bit more of an accurate or a target punter, but like Ross James is really, really good. And that helped Oregon's defense last year in a way that, wasn't afforded to the Ducks in 2022 because they were the worst punting team in the Pac-12. And that changed. And it's not the only reason the defense got better, but it helped. It helps when you pin your opponent, inside the 10, 15 yard line, or you don't give them the ball at their own 35 or 40 all the time. So that's one reason. Second reason, I think there's some competition in the kicking room. I expect Atticus Sappington to be the starter. I don't think he'd come to Oregon if there wasn't an almost guarantee that he's going to start. But we saw Grant Meters hit, I think it was a 49-yard field goal with plenty of leg to spare in the spring game. So at the very least, you have guys that have got a little bit more juice. It'll come down to whether they can hit kicks in big spots. But Sappington is an experienced college football player coming over from Oregon State. So I feel good about that. But going into last year, Camden Lewis was off a second-team All-Pac-12 selection season in 2022. He was really reliable that year if he was kicking against anybody not named Utah. And then last year, we all know what happened. So that's the unfortunate part of it. But going into a year, I don't know how much better you can feel. Atticus Sappington, very solid. Have solid expectations for him that he should be a reliable kicker. And what I need from an Oregon kicker or any college kicker, be reliable inside of 40 yards. Like, don't miss more than one or two throughout the year inside of 40. Once you get outside of 40, 40 to 45 should still be solid. Once you get outside of that, all right, it's not a reasonable expectation when you look at the number of elite kickers across the country. It's a very, very small number. But they've got a lot of names in that room. I think they've got enough talent to be good. The question I have on special teams is the return game. Now, is it as important as it used to be because there are a lot of fair catches and kickoff specialists are really, really good at just booting the ball through the end zone? No. Andrew Boyle has had some success in doing that. He needs to be a little bit more accurate with his kickoffs, but because he had problems a year or two ago kind of keeping the ball in play. But when he did, he had a really, really good touchback percentage, which is great. But I think Oregon's return game can have a more dynamic element. I'm curious to see if a guy like Roderick Pleasant is back there. Interested to see if Gary Bryant is taking a step forward as a return man. I like Tez Johnson as the punt returner. I thought he was really, really good last year and made some impact plays. But the kick return game is where Oregon can improve. And we'll see where they put guys. I could see a Jaden Lamar going back there, for instance. A guy who's obviously comfortable carrying the football as a running back. But I think Oregon special teams, which cost them a game a year ago, could have cost them other games because it really became a problem the second half of the season after that Washington game. And it was not the only reason that Oregon lost to Washington, of course, but it was certainly a reason. I think Oregon special teams are in a good place. I don't think they're going to be best in the Big Ten. You got a lot of great kickers and punters in this league because they don't play that much offense, but I think Oregon special teams overall in a good spot. It's like health insurance. You don't need it right until you do, and then it's deciding everything, and you got to have it. Car insurance, any type of insurance, flood insurance, home insurance, whatever you're talking about there. So it's not important right until it is, and I think Oregon is in a good spot. Thanks for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. For your second listen or Second View on YouTube. Go check out Locked On College Football, where I've got you covered with the biggest stories in the greatest sport on planet Earth. Appreciate everyone listening. I'll see you next time. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.